Okay, so we left off with scale. So scale is the perception of an object size based on its relation to the human body. So basically, you're just concerned that things look like they should be the right size. And in this example, it talks about, let's see, consistency. If the scale of plant forms and mass is constantly changing, the design is scattered and the viewer becomes confused. The height of a tree must be in scale to the size of the garden. A mass of shrubs must be appropriate to the size of the planting beds. So in other words, some of the challenges are maybe you have a huge tree in the backyard that changes the whole scale of the, say it's a small yard and you have a big backyard. So the challenge to use this design element is how to tie that tree down so the scale looks appropriate. So you're going to, instead of, if you have this big tree, massive tree that's 3 feet in diameter trunk in the corner of the backyard, and it's a small dinky backyard, the challenge is how are you going to make that look in scale? So if you plant a bunch of little tiny plants in front of it, then it's going to look out of scale. If you plant some vertical, taller plants underneath it to kind of try to keep it in scale, that's where the challenge is. So that's kind of something to keep in mind when you talk about scale. Any questions on that? Okay, so the next one is rhythm. So a pattern repetition of a design element at regular or irregular intervals, a design tool. It creates sequence of movement or pattern to a garden. So scale and rhythm can kind of be tied together. So you're repeating a pattern throughout the garden. Usually you say you've got a backyard, so you have a strong focal point, and say in the corner. You don't want to distract from that focal point by having stuff that isn't in rhythm leading up to the focal point. So whatever you say it's in the corner, and then on either side of it along the fence, those need to be similar type plants and color and texture, and then a similar type of pattern so that it leads the eye to the focal point. So here's a great example. So the first diagram just gives you an example of plants being in rhythm, but the second one that shows the front yard, figure number 5. See how that rhythm, you've got the conifers on either side, they're in the same type of rhythm. You've got the plants along the walkway, the same type of rhythm. That all leads the eye towards the entry of the house. Okay, so if they weren't in rhythm, then your eye is going to be kind of distracted and not focusing on the entrance of the house. Okay? Okay, sequence and rhythm are very similar. It's hard to tell the difference. So sequence, a design arrangement that moves the viewer's attention in a distinct way. Again, that's very similar to rhythm. It connects design principles because of movement from one part of the composition to another can be created through a change in form, color, texture, position, or size. Sequence can be created by changing one design component, but not all, or the result is chaos. Sequence through repetition unifies the design. So again, on that line drawing underneath there, sequence is obtained in the above drawing by alternating a large mass of shrubs with small masses of trees. So again, it's kind of uniform and it's kind of in sequence and it kind of creates rhythm as well. Okay. And then there's another example of rhythm where you create a unit of plantings. So there's unit 1, unit 2, unit 3, and you would repeat those throughout the landscape, so that there's kind of just a natural sequence that doesn't distract from the whole of the design. Okay, so simplicity, restraint, moderation, appropriateness in design. A simple elegance can be achieved through an emphasis on simple form, line, color, and texture. Less is more. And so, again, especially when it comes to planting, you don't want to have too many different varieties, too many different shapes, too many different colors, because it's real distracting. So usually you want to plant in mass, and you only want to use 5, 6, possibly 7 different varieties of plants in a landscape design. The tendency for homeowners and gardeners is they can't make up their minds as far as what plants they like. I like this, I like that, I want to put this in here, I want to put that in there. And as a result, then they have a landscape design that's really just chaotic and hard. It's hard for the eye to focus on any one point. So as a designer, you want to keep in mind, you want to limit the inputs that you put into your landscape design, so it's fairly simple and kind of elegant and not too chaotic. I always know when I walk into a yard that the person's a gardener. I call it the arboretum look, where they have one of everything, and they went to the nursery, found something they couldn't live without, and then they go home and try to find a place to put it, and then it just looks like chaos. My mother-in-law is a great example of that. She can't go to a nursery without buying something, then she's got to plant it someplace. So the 2 examples below, item A, lack of simplicity, where you just have a tree not really placed right, and there's no form or function. And then B is an example of simplicity. Okay, we're on to space articulation. The creation of space through the use of primary design elements. Space articulation creates rooms. So I'm sure, or maybe not, you guys have heard of kind of garden rooms. That used to be kind of it's kind of a thing of the past. Just like in housing or in homes, you want to be able to see throughout the house. It's kind of the same thing with the landscaping now. You don't want to create all these different sections of rooms and garden rooms, so to speak. You want to just be able to kind of enjoy the whole landscape as a whole. But there are areas that you do want to articulate and create rooms. And so the backyard would be considered one room. The front yard would be considered one room. The side yard, if you do any plantings on that, would be considered another room. So that's where you're trying to articulate the space. Symmetry. So some pretty good examples is just that, if you draw a line through the middle of your composition, that, things look the same. Like if you held a mirror up to that half, and it would look the same on the other side. So that's symmetry. So where you have this line drawing of this house, and the plantings are the same on either side. So that's symmetrical. Asymmetrical is the positioning of a design elements to create comparative irregular distortion or deviation. Balance and unity are essential to components of asymmetrical composition. So on the asymmetrical composition, when you're looking at that line drawing, the mass on one side needs to kind of match the mass on the other, even though it's spaced differently. So you have on the left-hand side of that line, you have a pretty solid mass of plants. On the right-hand side, you've got a small tree with some smaller plants underneath it. But if you were to measure the total mass, they would be pretty similar. So you go to line drawing the house, asymmetrical balance. It's kind of similar. I don't know why that was a mistake. We probably should take that other line drawing of the symmetrical thing in there. Somehow I just kind of put that in there. So make a note to take that out. Okay, unity. So the visual tying together of all the different components of an environment. Unity can be achieved through repetition of form, line, color, texture to create a sense of order. As with repetition, too much unity can become monotonous, while too little can become chaotic. So the first line drawing shows that the components are kind of split from each other, and there's not a lot of unity. So you have the tree on one side and you have a grouping of plants on the other. So that isn't unified, but you can tie the two together, and sometimes that's something to keep in mind in like a backyard. So they have some existing shrubs that they want to keep. Maybe it's because they're large mature plants and they kind of serve as some screening, or their favorite plants. They have some sentimental value. And so sometimes the challenge is, how do you unify the landscape while keeping these plants in the landscape? So this next line drawing is a good example of how you can unite those two separate plantings by using a horizontal grouping of plants. Okay, so that ties, the two plantings together. So that's kind of a kind of a skill that you need to kind of develop. So when you're looking at it, a backyard or maybe a front yard or something that they want to kind of freshen up or do that. So that's one way to tie two separate elements of a landscape together. Okay, variety. The diversity of design qualities and composition. It is the change or contrast in one or two of the design principles, line, form, mass, texture, or color, that holds the observer's attention. How much variety is appropriate to a design depends on the complexity of its design principles. Variety is the opposite of repetition. If overdone, it destroys unity. Variety planned with sufficient repetition can maintain unity. So the first line drawing underneath there, varying forms and value, but with the same size, little visual interest. So that's why one of the reasons you want to use different sized plants in your landscape, especially you want to have some 5-gallon size plants and some smaller plants. So in that other line drawing, you can see by having bigger plants, even though they're the same distance apart, it adds interest to the landscape design. So varying forms, value, and sizes, silhouette, more visual interest. So if all the plants are the same size, then you may have variety as far as different numbers of plants, but size and texture and things like that are what add to the visual interest of the landscape. So a couple more line drawings here that just kind of talk about having variety, but you need to kind of keep things kind of simple without having too much variety. So the first one says, this composition has simplicity through repetition, yet with variety. The lower rounded plants are used in sufficient numbers to provide unity in proportion to the two small evergreens and a small tree. And then the other one below it, this composition contains too much variety. As a result, too many vertical elements and too many different forms. Despite the smaller shrubs which unify the planting, it is distracting because there is no focal point that allows the viewer to differentiate the more important elements from the less important ones. Okay.
Okay. Yep.
And then another example of variety are these two line drawings of the house. So, you just have just a few plants in there, and without corner shrubs, the lines of the house seem stark and harsh. So with the corner shrubs, the corners are softer and less apparent. So that's something you always want to keep in mind in the front yard, and we'll get into this in the next section. But you always want to kind of soften the corners of the house. It helps visually tie the house down, and softens up the house a little bit. And so here are some more examples of how if you just have a few vertical elements and a few horizontal elements, it really doesn't tie the house down. But if you add some foundation plants along the side of the house, then it helps to tie the house down. Okay? Okay, so here I've got some photos, and I want to just kind of help you be able to kind of understand the design tools and design principles. So if you want to go to that very first page, the design synthesis, and use that as something, a reference when we talk about these different photos, then we can kind of do that. So I don't know, did you make a hard copy, or is this all just on the screen right now? Or can you put one on one screen and one on the other, Chris?
Yeah, I have it. So we got, let me bring it out here. And it's a little kind of like, looks like a flow chart type thing.
Yeah, that's the one we want to refer to. And then we have a photograph of a planting with a boxwood hedge in front of it. That's what we'll be referring to.
Okay. I'll add that into the document later on.
Okay. So you got both. Do you have both of those pulled up right now?
Yep.
Okay. So let's discuss this first photograph. So what are some of the?
And 6 are you talking about, or the picture of the hedge?
The picture that has the hedge in it.
Okay,
and the perennials back behind it. Okay, so if you kind of quickly glance through the design tools and design principles, which ones of those apply to this photo? So is there juxtaposition? Is there
what do you say, enframement?
Yeah, okay. You got enframement, so that boxwood hedge kind of frames that in, okay. Is there any bridging?
Yeah, I was going to say bridging. You got like the smaller plants connected between the larger plants. Is that?
Yeah. Okay, yeah. So you kind of go through there, and Will, you can do the same thing. If there's anything that kind of jumps out at you that kind of the design principle that kind of jumps out of your design tool.
Well, I mean, so the thing that I'm looking at is it's just it almost looks like a wild smattering of plants.
Right.
Maybe some repetition just in the coloring. I can't even tell in the photo if they are the same plant when I'm looking at it closely.
Yeah, so there is repetition of colors. So you have the different shades of yellow. Okay, so you got one that's closer to you, one in the middle, one down the way. So that's some repetition there. Space articulate.
What point of view? Because I kind of get drawn to like the red on the top there.
Yeah. Yeah. No. Yeah, that's a good one.
Well, which one's juxtaposition? What is that again?
Well, juxtaposition is two design elements that are put together that are completely different. So you
would that be a contrast of like the wildness behind the box hedge?
Yeah, right. So yeah, there's a juxtaposition. So you have this formal boxwood hedge, and then you've got this wild planting back behind it. So that's juxtaposition. There's two completely different design elements. They contrast each other, but yet they work. And so the boxwood hedge is the one that kind of helps it work. Okay. Okay. Let's go on to the next one with the stepping stones.
Okay.
So which design tools or design principles tie to this one?
I would say enframent, because you kind of have everything going straight down the center there.
Right.
I'm trying to remember what movement was in the design tool.
Well, I mean, so yeah, the stepping stones create a sense of movement, a sense of flow.
Yeah. What's tension point again?
A tension point is where, think of like a gate or an area where it narrows. Like if you're on a river and you're flowing down the river, a rapids where the river narrows, that would be a tension point. Yeah.
Okay, so I would say it's a tension point here, right?
Yeah.
It flows out and it kind of flows back in with the.
Yeah. So yeah, you're right, and so it's a repetition of tension points, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the repetition of the stepping stones, but also the repetition of. So you have plants that are planted kind of closer together, and then it opens up, and then another grouping that's planted closer together, and then it opens up, and down the way, it does the same thing. So yeah, there's some tension points in there.
Yeah.
The one thing to note from this, so look at the lawn. It's full of weeds and everything, but you really don't notice it at all because of the stepping stones and the repetition and the tension points and everything else. That just kind of fades into the background. So just something to keep in mind about how some really strong design tools and elements can kind of lessen some of the stuff that you would normally see as a distraction. Okay. Okay, let's go to the next one with the stairs. So, I mean, just kind of go right down through the design tools, and is there bridging?
I would say so, because you're kind of connecting the plants from the bottom to the plants at the top.
Yeah, exactly. Okay.
I wouldn't say there's tension points necessarily.
No, I wouldn't say so either.
No.
Yeah.
Enframent, not really. I mean.
But so.
From this angle, a little bit, but not too much. I wouldn't really say it would be on that one.
Right. I would say that this is kind of an example of a pivot point. So you're pivoting around that. See, you have that bench and stuff to your right. But how that stairway kind of wraps around that's what we would consider a pivot point. Okay. Is there movement? What's that?
I think there's definitely movement.
Okay, so the stairs kind of represent movement. Yeah. Okay, so.
Would you say a juxtaposition because you got the stairs with the contrast of the plants, but not so much though. The stairs are kind of overgrown with some of the
Yeah, that kind of takes away from the juxtaposition. But again, yeah, I think the stairs, because if you look back on behind that bench, looks like there's a lot of rock and stuff. So it's more in keeping with the general design.
Okay. What's baffle again? What's that one again?
Baffle is kind of think of like a soft hedge, the hedge that visually you can see through, but it kind of, think of I don't know, like a gauze curtain across your window. You can still see through it, but it's a kind of, it also represents a visual barrier. So yeah, that is
like a veil.
Like a what?
A veil.
Yeah, like a veil. Okay. Yeah.
Anything else on there? Anything we're missing?
I think you have some sequence, you have some rhythm. It's asymmetrical. It's not symmetrical. But yeah. Well, all I'm just trying to do is get you guys to kind of think about how these different design tools and principles apply to a landscape, and by being able to identify them, then you kind of get a better feeling of what they are. So let's go to this next one with the interesting checkerboard shaped. Yeah. So what is that? What's that element add to it?
That would be juxtaposition.
Right.
It would be a good part of juxtaposition, because you got the square and then the craziness.
Yeah. So does that create a focal point? I mean, where's your eye drawn when you look at this photograph?
I'm drawn to the wall, which is the same color of the ground underneath and between the checkers, and the same color of the flowers is all white.
Right. What would the wall represent as far as design tools or principles?
The focal point, or
yeah, something else. So unity. So that's what kind of ties the whole whole thing together.
Yeah, it's actually too. I mean, it's the colors too. Like it's almost like the colors bridge to each other.
Right.
Like we have the white throughout, but then we also have like those. I can't tell if they're roses, but they're like peaches, red, white, and then we have like a purple. So it's almost like the colors bridge to one another, almost like the palette is.
Yeah, you're right. Well, I mean, the colors all kind of, you got the white, which is kind of the unifying thing, but the other colors are very close on the color scale to white. You know, you got that's a white, not a white Julia, but brain fade here. The wisteria hedge, those are the purple blossoms on a kind of a trellis. And then you have, looks like you said, the roses and the white between I think those are just lavender that have been assured in those shapes. So yeah, you're catching on, guys. That's good. Let's go to the Valentine's picture here.
That would be symmetrical, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Definitely a point of view as well, right?
Yeah.
And then framing it.
Right.
Frame.
Yep.
There's contrast in there as well. You've got the red opposed with the green.
Right.
Flowers. What else? Anything else I'm missing on there?
Is there a tension point?
Yeah, would be right in the center there, right?
So where those are used, and so there's a where it leads out into that other lawn area. Okay. Okay. And so there's that's some enfraidment there too. So yeah, so you guys are catching on. That's kind of just the purpose of that exercise, is to just kind of take these different things that we've discussed and be able to kind of recognize them in an existing landscape, and then be able to use them in the future. So that's kind of the fun thing about landscaping and landscaping design, is everything's different. They all present their own challenges, matching up with the homeowner's likes and dislikes, working with your existing plants or lawn lines or everything. So every site's different. Every site has its own challenges. It's not, we're not mass producing things. We're not just putting on siding or gutters or something that's the same on every site. So that's the fun thing about it. Every site's different and it presents its own challenges. But with these design tools, then we're able to kind of overcome those challenges and come up with a design that's pleasing to the eye, and something that I know I look forward to going back to things I've done in the past. I went to Sittner the other day, a landscape design that we did 1 year ago, and to be able to see how it's kind of come together and the plants have grown, and talk with a customer that's just thrilled with the outcome, that's all kind of the thing that makes this business fun. So that kind of completes this one. I don't know if we want to stop here, Chris, and then start on the next one.
So that concludes part 2 of the design synthesis.
Yes.